Rachel Reeves has made the statement that is not a budget. It wasn't heartening. Predicted growth is down this year and tax receipts are lower than she hoped. Halving the health-related element of universal credit was never going to be easy, and now she's freezing it for the rest of this parliament. Many MPs are going to hate it. But is there anything to get our spirits up in this statement? Seth, can you see any grounds for optimism?
It depends on who for. I mean, if you're on benefits and you're not one of several specified groups, you're probably going to be worse off on balance after this budget. It's very good for the defence industry. If you're building drones or working in AI, there are ring-fenced funds going into that. But overall on the economy, it's not great news. As we had already sort of had trailed, the OBR has cut their growth forecast for this coming year down to 1%. Much better news on the medium term, which is it's gone up over the next 5 years or so between 1.7 and 1.9%. But these things are always
it gets your heart racing,
adjusted as you go along. Yeah. When you consider that EU membership was estimated to account for at least 3% growth, that puts that into perspective. Alignment with EU trades and services and goods, each 0.5% apiece. So you can see how all of these figures about 1 to 1.7, 1.9% all get put into perspective.
Yeah, but we do have our freedom now, though, so you know.
Yay.
Reeves obviously does want to grow the economy. What is her plan for doing that? Because this has been the talk, it's been growing, getting louder for months and months. Where is the growth going to come from? So where in the Reeves model, apart from the defence industry, which you've mentioned, is the growth going to come from?
They're going to reform the planning laws so that that will hopefully bring about a boom. On that front, there are various investment funds that are intended to stimulate growth across different sectors. But above all else, they're counting, I think, for credibility and confidence by sticking to these fiscal rules and doing so in a sort of ironclad way. Now, yes, they're increasing the sort of fiscal headroom against future financial crises. The idea is that we're going to be shock-proofed against any unexpected things because the degree to which we've got fiscal headroom is about 6 billion. When you consider the hundreds of billions in the budget, this is not a huge margin to begin with. We're going to have capex spending up 2 billion a year. Again, this is not huge money in the grand scheme of things. And it does depend on some very, very optimistic targets being hit. Like we've been told, you're going to save £7.5 billion a year, raised by clamping down on tax evasion. Well, what government hasn't promised to do that?
And productivity. We're all going to have to become much more productive as well in order to meet these goals.
I suppose that means no longer recording podcasts.
No. Paul Johnson at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who is the number cruncher extraordinaire, of course, at these occasions, says this is just kicking the hard decisions about tax rises down the road to the autumn. Is he right?
Yeah. I mean, Reeves was very, very clear in the statement. We're not going to be raising taxes and we're going to be looking at other savings that we can make, particularly on welfare. And when you're looking at an increase of defence spending to 2.5%, and she's already said we have an aspiration next Parliament of 3%, that's optimistic double counting. I think it's inevitable there'll have to be tax rises. And in fact, if you look at polling on this, most people believe that it's more or less inevitable. So it's almost a net loss in just stringing this along rather than coming out and saying what we've expected.
Marie, the expert opinion on the Labour side seems to be a bit divided between just raise taxes, you'll have to do it anyway, as Seth has just outlined, or the electorate will never forgive a betrayal like that. Which side are you on?
Oh, I am 100% the former, and I think that's an argument I've made on this very podcast for several months. Since they got elected, I was like, oh my fucking God, just raise taxes. No, so I think they should raise taxes, but I think because essentially I think they will have to do it, as Seth, kind of pointed earlier, they will have to do it at some point in this Parliament anyway. And what worries me is that the more time they spend going, we're not going to do that, we're not going to do that, we're not going to do that, the more ammunition they're giving, be that the Tories or the unfriendly press, to say, and I, back in my news desk days, I definitely wrote articles like that of going, 17 times ex-politicians said they wouldn't do this thing before they, did it. So it's a bit like, if you're going to do something, stop spending months and months making extra sure that everyone knows that you're definitely not going to be doing this. I think it would have been cleverer to come in and go, okay, we're fully aware this was an election promise, but X, Y, and Z happened. And then or you use maybe, I don't know, like Donald Trump or like something, and then you go, no, this is it. And then also I think you give you give yourself more time to do stuff with that money, so you can maybe make things better for people so they can actually see that there was a reason behind you doing it. And B, I think you also give people the chance to maybe hopefully forget about it because you'll have done quite a lot, and a lot of time will have passed, etc. So I think the more you wait, the more likely, ironically, it will bite at the next election.
Yeah, I mean, the big argument, I suppose, as well, is that they have raised taxes, of course, but just not on working people, which is the way to raise loads of taxes quickly. And of course, that means they also really can't raise things like VAT, which would be another thing they could possibly do. But actually, in the real world, people's wages are rising surprisingly fast. So in a way, that's almost an argument to raise taxes on working people, isn't it?
It is. Again, I think the kind of like cost of living crisis is, for the most part, behind us now, or at least the kind of worst of it. So it's not necessarily like raising taxes now would not be necessarily kicking people while they're down. So basically, I'm just being very boring and agreeing again with both your point, my point, Seth's point of being like, yeah, just raise bloody taxes.
Anyone disagree with that we should raise taxes in some form? And if so, which ones?
Well, I think, again, that this is going to have to happen eventually, and it was always going to have to happen eventually. And I thought that the one that would have made the most sense was probably saying, listen, Jeremy Hunt cut Nick's like 2 seconds ago and definitely couldn't afford to do that when he did it, and did it so that he could go into the election being like, oh, I've done this thing and promising more. We've had a look and we can't tolerate, we can't as a country like maintain things if...
Oh, I quite like that. A bit like returning an item because you bought something online a bit drunk and then you're like, actually, you know what? So like 28 days after the purchase, you're like, nope. So I like the idea of doing the same with tax rises or tax. Yeah.
I guess the problem with it fundamentally is like that would have been immediately breaking like a cornerstone manifesto promise, right? And but these manifesto commitments were made, and when you've got, I think it's cumulatively income tax, national insurance, and VAT, like 75% of the tax take, something like that. It's whatever it is. It's huge, just between those 3 taxes. And it always sort of reminded me of, those like novels which are like, I've written this novel and I've not used the letter E in it at any straight, like this constrained writing and everything. And it's like, oh, isn't it so impressive to have written a novel that doesn't have the letter E in it at all? And you're like, just use E, bro. Like, it's right
if
there.
I were you, I would simply...
Yeah, it's right there. Like, why have you just told yourself that you can't use like the most common thing? It's really hard now.
I did try reading that novel once. It just wasn't very good.
Can I follow the novelist analogy? Because there seems to be an iron rule of British politics followed by all parties that we are in favour of hard-working people. And this is why we want to tax the scroungers and the unpopular people, the lazy, idle, feckless people, while the worthy people who earn their keep and live hard and play by the rules and all this kind of stuff. Well, every cliche you can think of. What about the people who aren't hardworking? I don't mean that people who aren't hardworking are inherently scroungers. What I mean is there are plenty of people who actually, let's take artists, they measure their worth by what they contribute to society in non-financial ways. And I think a lot of our fundamental framing on this is very, very questionable because it misses out these quality of life points which aren't measurable in these sort of financial indices. And that's not a way of inculcating that kind of healthy culture in the longer run.
There was a brief period during this where I thought that you were going to suggest taxing my jokes. You'll take them from my cold, dead hands, mate.
Only if they're bad.
I do think, and I'm not exactly known for being a big defender of his, but I do think that's something Jeremy Corbyn did try to get at a few times, and the problem is he did get roundly mocked by absolutely everyone for being, a hippie dipshit. So no, I agree with you, but I do think it was slightly tried, but. And that was always going to the problem, I think, of, Keir Starmer coming in and very much throwing the baby with the bathwater. I don't think they ever bothered really looking through everything Corbyn and McDonnell did and, whether anything could be salvaged, what should be kept, what shouldn't be kept, etc. And which is a bit frustrating because I'm sure there were actually a few things that could have, become part of the Starmer project.
Yeah, I mean, there's a wider question about well-being economics, which doesn't rank anywhere in this. And I'm not saying that there's any kind of hatred for it. It's just it's been totally left behind.
I tried. I'm going to try and keep this a bit vague. I generally had quite a long, interesting chat with a senior Starmer advisor about this. But I think it was just before the election, maybe? Because I wrote it, before the election. So I'd written a column for the New Statesman essentially saying who will be the political party arguing for, essentially, as you said, that quality of life, for a good life, a fun life, a healthy, kind of fulfilling life. And then following that, so the advisor and I had a chat and he was like, I read your piece, really liked it. And that is definitely something we are kind of trying to look into and thinking about. And there was that, oh my God, yay. And then nothing came out of that. So here we are.
What I would say is that, it is part of the problem here that if if any government of any stripe like came out and said, but the national happiness index is up 4%, you'd be like, come on, though. Like, as in, like, what? Like, it would feel like they were trying to dance around the fact that economically things weren't going so well. So whatever. And this is apart from the point that obviously there are other elements to human lives, etc. But it would feel like a government was using that as an excuse to.
It feels a lot like kind of, like incredibly patronizing documentary into the 90s of like some white guy going to Africa going, they have nothing, but they're happy.
I take your point. And, in the 70s, for example, Jimmy Carter ran into trouble because he had something called the misery index, which he used to sort of quantify misery under Gerald Ford, and then he didn't mention it on his re-election campaign because it was astronomical when he was president.
That's so weird.
Yeah, no, it was the 70s. But
This sounds like a fucking Stephen King novel.
No, it was a thing. What I'm getting at is not using indices like this. It's just a simple point, which is if you're a government that doesn't have very much money to spend, then looking at really, really cheap ways of making voters happy might not be a bad idea.
All comes down to the bins.
I've never really understood why they don't go for capital gains tax because, of course, it is a tax paid by working people, but arguably you're not doing quite as much work always when you are increasing your capital monopoly style as when you are a son of, a son of the earth and going out and working and being employed or self-employed. So that's always been a mystery to me why they can't go a bit harder on that, but they haven't. Marie, Rachel Reeves is personally pretty unpopular now. I mean, we're talking quasi-Kwarteng levels of unpopular. Do you think that matters?
I think it does, because the Treasury, I think, for a number of reasons. The first one being that the Treasury is holding quite a tight grip, I think, on the rest of Whitehall. So she's very much the person, I think, where the Treasury is, the place where all the decisions are made. And I think a lot of the departments are getting a bit frustrated. So if you've got someone with that much power, even by kind of Chancellor levels, you probably do need that person to be able to say to their kind of ministerial colleagues, hey, but, people like what I'm doing. So, shut up and listen and I'm cutting your budget for X or Y or Z. But that is good and fine and you're going to shut up because I'm popular and because what I'm doing is popular. You can't really use that argument, I think, internally if it's, proven time and time again in polls that actually you're incredibly unpopular. So I think there's partially that. I think there's partially the problem as well that I think Keir Starmer's numbers, I believe, are not dreadful, but he's not exactly a kind of like happy, clappy, super kind of like, charismatic guy. And it's not, and you do kind of need, I think that's the slide. And I think, annoyingly, a duo like Cameron and Osborne worked really well. Like they worked really well as a unit together. And I'm not convinced Starmer and Reeves do because they share a lot of the same qualities, but a lot of the same drawbacks as well. And so I think if you lose, if Reeves becomes really unpopular, I suspect that would end up, dragging Keir down quite quickly as well.
Ahir, the government can't raise most taxes, and as we talked about, and it has to tiptoe around Trump for fear of more tariffs, and it's nervous of the electorate, which kind of shows it's afraid of America. Is all this starting to show? It just feels like we're a bit frit at the moment.
But, I mean, on the one hand, like, being afraid of what the American government might do is not necessarily like a wholly irrational position, right? Like, I'm afraid of snakes because they're horrible and wish me harm, right? And that's like it's a pretty rational. Like if something is like cruel and capricious and willing to do harm in an instant to ostensible friends and allies and everything, then being wary of that is not necessarily like the weirdest thing in the world. And like I think that sort of thing has been obvious for a very long time now. Though I think like all of this like. Every time you hear the use of the phrase like this special relationship and this like it always feels like this is less and less the case and there's a greater and greater inequality between these partners as time wears on. So that I think shows but also isn't surprising. And I guess that there is like the fear around the taxes and stuff, but as we've discussed, is because of basically walls that have been constructed for themselves, right? Because on other things where there's a bit more space to maneuver, like it's not like the planning bit, like, and maybe people who are like super sort of ultra yimbies would say like, oh, there are a few ways in which that this could have gone even further, which fair enough, like if that's your position. But I don't think that anyone's saying that this is like a tiny fixing around the edges thing, or like that is a pretty big radical thing to be doing. And so it shows that that is possible. It's just not going to be possible in things where you have intentionally tied a hand behind your back.
Seth, last week Liz Kendall tried to persuade MPs that her benefits reforms would get more people into work. What do we know now about what the impact will be?
I mean, the government's own analysis shows that about 3 million people will broadly be worse off, while about 3.8 million will be better off, but by rather less. So net negative overall impact.
Has she yet convinced enough Labour MPs of her case? Because David Lammy may be on board or at least sympathetic, but some of the cabinet are reportedly very unhappy.
Yeah, and not just the cabinet. I mean, there is that heated debate I alluded to at the beginning that they had in the meeting, and that's sort of already leaked out, which is never good news that some of your own cabinet ministers are talking to the press about the nature of that. But bear in mind the challenge we have for this government is very much where Labour was from about 1997 to about 2005, which is that they've got 400 and something MPs, of whom about 300 are backbenchers. That's a lot of backbenchers who, yes, they take the government whip, but they are going to be annoyed. They're going to be newly elected MPs in many cases who thought, I worked my socks off to get here. And for this, to be pushing a new form of austerity, really?
The
for the
Labour
Labour
government?
Exactly, all of this stuff. Yeah. So, are they going to carry this through? Of course they are. They've got the numbers for it. Is it going to be difficult? Quite possibly. Even an insignificant number, something like 50 MPs rebelling, would still be a lot of MPs.
Well, it's also, and it's a point I've made, like several times in this podcast, apologies to people who do listen to every episode, but, and it's been proven time and time again that rebelling as a member of parliament is actually a very addictive thing. So there's a massive gap between someone who's never rebelled, someone who has once, but then once you've rebelled against the government, your party or your whip once, you become a lot more likely to do it again and again afterwards. So I think it is the Boris Johnson problem of, I think, if you piss off lots of different people one by one, but you keep sort of winning, so you have a big majority.
I thought you meant that it's the Boris Johnson problem, because I was like, what is it like being unfaithful or something?
But seriously, I mean, you create malcontents who then find other reasons to be malcontents and become the go-to person where I'm a previously loyal MP, I'm thinking about voting against the government, let's talk.